Hello everybody, welcome back to Littleton Model Railway. Today I'm going to make this kit, which is a Pug by Dapol. The instructions for this kit are broken down into lots of small steps with nice clear diagrams. Once I'm done reading the instructions, I tip the kit out onto a cutting mat and begin to familiarise myself with all the different pieces. I cut the pieces from the sprues with a craft knife, and if there's any flashing left on the pieces, I file that down with a sanding block to ensure that when the pieces go together, they're a nice fit. To make this kit, I'll be using Humbrol's liquid poly cement. It comes with a brush inside the lid, although in this case for some of the finer pieces, I'll be using a fine paintbrush to apply it. Here I'm applying liquid poly to the locating pin and the locating sockets on both sides of the frame. After waiting a few seconds for the plastic to soften on both parts, I then join the pieces together, and when this sets, it will form a permanent and very strong bond. After waiting a few minutes for it to start to set, I then apply liquid poly to the top of the frames and the underside of the running board, making sure that I pass along the locating strips. I then join the frames to the running board, making sure that I orientate the two pieces correctly. This is important because part of the pistons is moulded into the frames. When applying the liquid poly to the body of the locomotive, I take great care to make sure that I cover all of the areas that will make contact with each other when I join the two pieces together. This is to ensure that when I'm looking at the body, which is the main part that you tend to look at, that there are no gaps. In particular, I don't want the chimney coming apart a bit like a peeled banana. As I tried to join the two pieces together, I wasn't quite happy with how they lined up. So I made a decision to actually remove the locating pins on one side of the body. And then the plan was that as it dries, I would manipulate it into place with my fingers so that all of the parts lined up properly. As I'd spent a while fettling the pieces, the liquid poly had begun to set, and so I applied a bit more to re-soften the plastic before trying to join them back together again. This part took a while, as I now needed to hold the pieces carefully in place whilst the liquid poly set to ensure that everything lined up properly. With the body done, I can now move on to building the cab. To start this, you apply liquid poly to the base of the cab sides and the edges of the running board. These pieces fit together really nicely. In fact, without glue, you can balance the cab side on the running board no problem. And then it's on to the cab front and back head. I apply liquid poly around the base of the back head and then the sides of the front of the cab. Remember to apply liquid poly to the front of the sides of the cab as well as the running board where the back head is going to make contact. I then put the front of the cab into position, gently pressing on the cab sides to make sure that there is good contact. I then run the brush up the inside of the corner. This also helps smooth out any joins as well as improving the adhesion of the parts. Now we finally get to move on to putting the body on the chassis. So for this I apply liquid poly to all of the flat parts underneath and around the boiler that make contact with the running board, and also around the back of the boiler where it makes contact with the front of the cab. and then of course I add liquid poly to the corresponding areas on the running board and the front of the cab. The body fits in nice and easily, and then we can move on to adding the handbrake. To do this, you just apply a bit of poly to the locating pin and the locating hole inside the cab. Make sure that the handbrake has properly set before moving on to the next bit, because if it falls out after doing the back of the cab, it will be a real bugger to get it back in. To attach the rear of the cab, you apply liquid poly around the back of the existing cab that you've built so far, the edge of the running board and also the back edges of the frames. You then of course run liquid poly around the back of the cab itself on the edges and where the frames will rest against the back side of the buffer beam. What's convenient here is the buffer beam is one piece with the back of the cab. Around the front of the engine, the buffer beam is a separate piece. Moving on to the front of a locomotive, we now get to add the smoke box front and smoke box door. These didn't quite fit, so I did a little more filing so it was a nice snug fit. And then liquid poly is added around the inside of the body and the edge of the smoke box front. Because this is a flush fit piece, it's easiest to add it using a pair of tweezers. Now that the majority of the work is done, I add 3 coats of a Vallejo primer using an airbrush. To ensure the interior of the cab receives a proper coat of primer, I have not added the roof. Now that the paint is dried, I use a filing block to remove the paint from the top of the cab SOT walls, and then also to remove it from the underside of the cab as well, so that it can be glued together. Now it's time to add the wheels. To do this, you apply liquid poly to the locating pins and sockets on the axles, and these have grooves cut into them so that when you join them together through the frames, you have the wheels properly quartered. Before the liquid poly sets, make sure you check that the wheels can turn. If they don't, take it apart and put a file through the axle box to widen it. Although this is a static model, it is nice if the wheels turn, and even if you're not planning on pushing it around anywhere, having the wheels being able to turn does make it easier to fit the coupling rods later on. Fitting the front buffer beam is nice and straightforward. There is a single locating strip that slots between the frames and then slides up to meet the running board. And to fit the buffers, just add a bit of liquid poly to the locating pins and the locating sockets. The next bit is a little bit tricky and you do need to take care and take your time with this. So to fit the coupling rods, just add a tiny spot of glue to the tip of the locating pin that holds the running gear in place, making sure not to get any of the liquid poly on the front of the wheel or the back of the pin or the back of the coupling rod. You will need to put the coupling rod on first before you add the glue to the pin, otherwise some of the glue may rub off onto the coupling rod as you push the pin through the hole. Unfortunately, I'm missing the bit of footage that shows me fitting the pistons onto the locomotive. The same advice applies though. You need to be very careful to make sure that you avoid getting the liquid poly on any of the moving parts. The piston itself is a single piece that glues straight onto the frames. Putting the rods in, it's very useful to have a pair of tweezers to hand, also for doing the additional pins as well. I finished it off with a spray of Vallejo black, covered with Vallejo satin varnish, and then Humbrol signal red enamel paint for the buffer beams. So this was a cheap and fun little project to do, and also the great thing about these kits is you can modify them to build something completely different. See my other video about how I made a mobile water tank. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you again next time.